You're doing it, aren't you? They're doing it. Hello, minders. Welcome back to the Mind Watercolor. Well, if you're making some of the mistakes in water control that I'm going to talk about today, don't feel bad. We've all made them. We all continue to make them from time to time. And these don't include everything that will help you have perfect water control. But these are big things that are often overlooked. And attending to them, trying to correct them, is a good way to kind of fine-tune that water control, those beautiful blends, those beautiful skies and landscapes. These are things you can analyze in your own painting and see how it improves how you paint. Without further ado, let's get into them. Now, I want to point out something that, seriously, this may be a duh moment. You may say, well, Steve, this is obvious, but you'd be surprised. You are painting with water. Basically, watercolor is colored water. You're not painting with watercolor paint per se. A watercolor mixture, if I were to guess at the math, it's like 99.9% water. Once pigment is dissolved in that water, it makes up very, very little of it. So you're painting with water. Now that's as opposed to something like oil or acrylic, where the medium or the paint oftentimes, and it can be thin too, but oftentimes the paint is the medium or makes up the medium. Even when you add medium, you still have a significant amount of paint and pigment. With watercolor, you are painting with water. I think that's helpful for beginners to think about. The first issue I see very often is being unaware, or let's face it, a little bit lazy, about changing the level of water in your brush and your paper. It's never constant, and it can vary drastically. So this is a saturated brush. You dip the brush fully, you lift it up, and it drips out. You can't get any more water in that brush. And usually that produces a puddle. Now what you want to be able to do is go from that to almost dry in an instant. One of the ways I like to do that is to grab a rag and squeeze. Squeeze very hard. Now it'll still be damp, but you can see I'm not putting any water on the paper. That is something you need to practice. That is something you need to employ all the time. So let's look at how I adjust water as I'm going along. And by the way, every level of water between that and dry in between is something that you might use. So you need to be very adept at changing the amount of water quickly and with practice accurately. Let's just look at how, first of all, the methods I use for changing the water content on the paper and in the brush. And yes, I use all of this. And I really feel like this is important. You can't overdo this. I mean, literally, the more blotting material you have at your hand, the better, because you're going to make drastic changes, you're going to make micro changes, and you're going to do it all the time. Or at least you should. And that's the point of this first mistake that I see all the time. Just not being willing to take that step, or being unaware that you need to take that step to change that level of water here and here. So on my right, I'm right-handed. On my right, this is what I have set up. It usually sits on the other side of my palette. My palette sits here, and this sits on the other side of my palette, and my water sits at the top. So I wouldn't have my painting here, I'd have my palette. I use a car wash sponge. I used to use a roll of toilet tissue. I would take a roll of toilet tissue and then I would wrap a paper towel around it a couple times. That makes a great maxi blotter, I guess you could call it. A blotter that takes out the maximum amount of moisture. I switched from that to a car sponge. It doesn't matter. Whatever works for you. It can just be a straight up sponge if you want. The way I use that is usually for big brushes, and when they are soaking wet, and I've been using them soaking wet, a lot of times I will use this to just dump that moisture. I may not want them completely dry, but that instantly takes that out without making my towel very wet. And usually the bigger the brush, the more likely I am to use this, just to dump a lot of moisture. The towel I have here is a main wiping tool. So maybe I want to get rid of some of the water. I'll wipe it there. Usually I'll use the towel for smaller brushes. Full body wipe, just wiping the tip, any combination thereof. All of these techniques are very important for you being able to micro adjust the amount of moisture in your brush. It's really that important. You don't want to go along with a constant mix of this much water and this much pigment. We'll get into a minute into why that's important. In my left hand, I'll have a rag, because if I'm right up on my painting, I like to be able to just reach over, flick, or it works well to drastically change with the squeeze technique. So if I've got a lot of water in my brush, any amount of water in my brush, and I want to go to almost dry, just a tight, hard squeeze. And that brush is as dry as it can be without completely bone dry to the air. And finally, I will have a piece of paper towel, usually folded 3 or 4 layers folded like this. This is helpful if you have color in your brush, for instance. You can see how much color is there along with the water. If you're trying to get color out of your brush, you can see if it's gone. These rags usually are not white or get dirty, so I'll blot it on there just to say, okay, yeah, that's good. I use paper towels frequently on the paper surface. So we're painting along here and you get a puddle and maybe you've been wetting it or you're setting up for doing a wet wash and you've got too much water. So I will usually just stick a corner of a paper towel in there and boom, it's gone. Facilitating your painting process so that you can change the water here and here in an instant and drastically or very subtly if necessary is so important. I have seen many students, they will start out with probably half of this much paper towel and that's it. That's all they'll have. And after just a few wipes, that thing is soaking wet and they'll just continue painting along. No way to get rid of water in here. No way to get rid of water on their paper. Nothing. This is a water medium. So that's what you're managing. Also, if you're not changing the water in your brush, for instance, your mixtures are all going to be the same and they're most likely going to have too much water. One big side effect of not being willing or not being aware of needing to change the water in your brush is that you're usually bringing too much water to the paper in certain circumstances. Maybe not in the beginning when you're doing a wet wash, but as you paint, usually you need to use drier and drier mixtures or less water and more pigment. So if you're using a constant amount of water or you're not changing it enough, your mixtures are going to be weak or they're all going to just kind of blend together. So not only do you need to be able to change the moisture and water in your brush quickly and easily, but you need to be able to change the intensity quickly and easily. Go to more water. Go to less water. Wash your brush out. Check its pigment level. Get more pigment. More pigment with less water. This is something you need to practice. And practice the extremes. Practice going from extreme wet applications like this to almost dry, where you're just patting in a little pigment. Practice taking water back off of the paper. Practice till you're able to get exactly the wetness and water level that you're looking for. And don't forget about your bowl. When you get into subtle changes of water control, you may have a dripping wet brush, saturated, and you want to reduce that just a little bit. Just a few wipes will do it. That has changed the water here, and that comes into play in various situations. You'll know when you're painting along, if you're painting, you're saying, I've got too much water, I can tell. Rather than continuing to paint, think about what do I do to change that? Maybe a few wipes here. That's picking up and dispersing that paint and moisture a little bit. Have a blotting and moisture changing solution for every possible situation. It can be anything. Okay, I just dipped my brush in here, it's dripping. Well, I just changed my mind. Shunk. Take all of it right back out. Don't be lazy about it. Don't be sitting there painting thinking, well, I know I really need to change the water. I got too much, but I'm just going to go ahead and paint. Look, I use the word lazy because I have done this so many times. I have painted when I knew that I shouldn't. So I say it good-naturedly. Don't be lazy about making drastic water adjustments when needed, or any water adjustments when needed, and set yourself up for success. And one final word about that, one of the best ways of adjusting moisture here is letting your paper dry. Don't be lazy about letting your paper dry. Get a hairdryer or a heat tool if you're in a hurry. But don't paint when you know you shouldn't be painting. And water will stay damp on the surface in the paper for a while, even after it doesn't look wet anymore. So if something needs to dry, let it dry. Adjusting the moisture level in your brush and your paper is critical. It is a key to water control. Don't neglect it. The second mistake I see very often, I don't know if it's really a mistake as much as it's just being unaware, is utilizing the full potential of your brush as a water manager. It goes hand in hand with the first one, and being able to drastically change that moisture level here as well as in your paper. But there's a lot you can do on the paper to manage that water level. So let's put this gold color down here. Obviously, when you're painting, you use a brush, but you're not just applying paint. So it's really just a paradigm, a shift in your thinking. You're controlling how much paint the ratio is to the water. So your brush is going to be the way that you change that. This is different than just about any other medium. Well, you can do this with acrylic, but I mean, and you can thin, of course, with oils, but you drastically change what's going on your paper just by changing the amount of water, adding it, taking water out of your brush and getting a drier application and just putting in pigment. And now you're not just adding pigment and paint, you're piggybacking off of the amount of moisture that you created in the previous application. So it becomes a feel. It becomes a water management tool, not just a painting tool. Think about the difference. Think about how you're managing the paint and the water that's on the paper. And probably one of the biggest overlooked pluses in water management that the brush has is the lifting ability. Remember the squeeze. Do a nice hefty squeeze. That brush is about as dry as it can get. And you've just applied another management technique. Now, the water I dipped in here to get rid of some of the pigment because I don't want to add any pigment, but then I'm wiping it out. And if your brush is drier than the surface, it's going to pick up as much moisture as is willing to come. You're managing pigment, water, the amount of water on the paper, the amount of water in your brush, the ratio at which they mix. You can apply paint and water, and you can lift paint and water. Just to demonstrate another way. I would normally squeeze this if I had both hands, but I'm just going to blot it real hard. Now watch. Blot it again. It took up about half of that excess water. There, it's all gone. You know, and I also need to mention, when it comes to using your brush as a water management tool, or a painting tool in general, another sort of a sub-mistake, getting the size right. It's very common for beginners to choose the wrong size, usually too small. Make sure you're choosing a size that's appropriate for the amount of area you want to paint. A lot of the bigger brushes, if you choose a good quality brush with a good point, you can fill in a nice size area very cleanly and very quickly versus doing a similar size area with a small brush. Now watch, this size is not a big problem, but if you get to painting really big area, you want to make sure that you have a brush that covers that area quickly and efficiently, and it'll give you a fresh, clean result. So when you're using this very powerful water and pigment management tool, get the size right. Don't overlook your brush as a water control and water management tool. Practice this. Practice, again, the extremes. Adding lots of water, adding a little bit of water, drying the brush out with a nice squeeze, picking water back up, adding pigment with little water, adding pigment with more water, just to try all the combinations. Make them drastic, because what you want to be able to do is match any scenario of wetness and pigment strength. And finally, Don't be so shy and timid and precious and stingy with your paint. Get out and make some big, bold washes. Some big, bold mixes on your palette. You can see the color better. You can have a great rainbow of variegation. And you just give yourself plenty to work with. Now, obviously, if you're painting a detail, a very little detail, you don't need a lot of paint. Generally, that's not the case, and generally you will use a lot of paint, even to paint details. But when you go to mix a color, it usually requires mixing several colors. I like to really get out some water, really loosen up some pigment. And I love to move the pigment into zones. Zones where the pigment is by itself, or zones where they kind of pool and mix together. And you want to make sure you mix enough paint to paint the area you're trying to paint. Skies, for instance, is a big one. Now, to paint skies, I'm probably going to get rid of all of this greenish palette dirt. You can do that pretty quickly. Just loosen it up. Get a tissue, by the way, another great blotting tool. Didn't even get into that. If you're being precious with your paint and afraid to waste it, you're not painting. Not really. Get the paint out there. Mix it. Be generous with it. Some Payne's gray over here. I'm thinking maybe a sky that has a few violet touches. Big sky, I might even want more than that. But maybe you're mixing with a very limited palette. Maybe you're only using 3 or 4 colors in the entire piece. So getting a lot out there and mixing it and having access to a complex mix throughout the painting is important. It's also important, not to run out in the middle of a nice big wash. Again, create drastic changes in your brush moisture. You can pick up a little of it. Augment it as you need to. Don't be stingy. If you've only just mixed a little puddle of paint, like that size, you're going to be constantly going back and remixing. Also, don't add too much water to your palette. Add enough to get a pool out there. But make sure it's a very rich, inky pool. You can always dilute it down as you're bringing it to your paper. If your mixed paint is too diluted, then all of your washes are going to be weak. Now, I've got some very rich, inky mixtures here, going from ultramarine to cerulean to sort of a magenta or violet. I've got a nice kaleidoscope of rich mix, and I can choose little bits of that or a lot. One of the keys, of course, to getting good rich mixtures is to make sure you pre-wet your palette. Now, I use M-Gram paint. M-Gram is a honey-based paint, so of course it's very easy to re-wet. Just a damp brush usually pulls up paint really, really quickly with almost no waiting for it to loosen and soak in. But there are a number of brands out there that are slower to re-wet. And it just kind of facilitates the process of getting nice, rich, inky mixtures out there. If you're painting with a paint that takes a little bit longer to re-wet, just be patient. Get water on there and let it soak. You can use a spray bottle. What I like to use is actually this, and I'll just go down the line and stream water onto my pans. But give it time. Diluting enough pigment, knowing how to get enough deep pigment into your water is part of being able to quickly get that ratio of color to water that you want. Keep in mind that as you dissolve this pigment into water, you don't need to keep adding water. That just continues to keep your paint and your mixture weak. Remember that this right here is water also. And this can be picked up and used to pull out more pigment. If you keep adding water to a mixture, you're just going to continue to thin it out. Now, if I want access to a good dark mixture like that, I will usually keep it there without adding any more water and add a little more water somewhere else, either a little further down on the mixing surface or another well entirely if you're using something like this. You want to be able to approximate that depth of tone or the exact depth of tone that you're looking for pretty quickly and easily without having to think a lot about it. That's just another part or aspect of not being stingy with your mix. Get that paint out there, get it dissolved into that water. Get some nice big areas mixed up appropriate to what it is you're painting. Get plenty of rich, deep pigment out there. You can always thin it out to the side. Add a little water to it on the surface. And very quickly, there were just very few little modifications. I've got a nice 3-step value scale. Add water to your palette and go away. Come back in 15-20 minutes. All right, thanks everyone. I hope that little back to the basics segment was helpful. Been a while since I've done one. Let me know in the comments what you have trouble with in your water control, and if this is helping you solve any of the problems. Or if you've got some good solutions for water control, let us know what those are too. Thank you so much, patrons, for your support. Really appreciate it. We'll see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.